Hey y'all, Lossien here. Join me on a quest today as we turn all of this into this. You're going to want waist, smallest part of the torso. It can be lower or higher on people. Your hips, which is the widest part of your butt. Where I like to also take a thigh measurement. Try and get the thickest part of your thigh. We want to take a knee measurement and an ankle measurement. We're going to take from the waist all the way to the floor. That's how I like to do it because I am only one person. We're going to take the inseam, which is from the side of your crotch all the way to the floor, from the crotch to the knee, just so I know approximately where it is. Now the hard one is the rise. So for this you want a straight ruler, and you're gonna put it between your legs right up against and try and get it as straight as you can. I have no idea how straight that is. And then you're gonna measure from the waist straight down to that measurement for the front, and from your waist straight down that measurement for the back. And the back is probably longer than the front. So we are starting with a mock-up, which means we're using really cheap fabric that we got for a great deal. We're going to use a ruler, a measuring tape, and some different color Sharpies. Okay, we don't want a side seam because hers doesn't have a side seam. We're going to take 1/4 of the hip measurement. This is nice and wide. Add 3 inches. And make sure we're at least that far from the side seam, plus seam allowance. So this is going to be our middle mark. This is our new side seam. This is going to run all the way from the top to the bottom. We're going to choose a top mark that gives us enough space, and then we're going to measure down the back rise amount. So this was the measurement from the crotch to the waist along the back. Okay, plus we're going to give ourselves an extra 1/2 inch just so we can move. And then we're going to make a line perpendicular to that all the way across. That is our hip line. I'm just going to put an F here and a V here so we know this is the front and this is the back. Now we're going to also measure down to our knee. I'm going to make a little knot mark and then all the way to the ankle. And we're going to draw those lines all the way out. This type of ruler is great for it, or a quilting ruler, because it's got the lines so you can make sure it is actually straight. So we're going to take our hip measurement, which is this line here, and we're going to divide it by 4, which for me means it's 10 1/4. So normally you would draw out 10 1/4 towards the front and towards the back, but what we're actually going to do is shift it by 1/2 inch, so the back has 1/2 inch more. That way it actually lays where it wants to lay. Then as we go to the knee, we're going to do the same thing. So you could actually just lay it out like this, which would be 15, and then just shift it by 1/2 inch. Now for the ankle, I'm going to give myself an extra inch because if I make things the width of the ankle, especially if there's no stretch, I can't get them over my heel. At this point, we can connect from the ankle to the knee. So it's 1/16 of the hip measurement is what we're going to use. So for me, that's 2.5 inches towards the front. And we're gonna add an inch on that to the back, so it's 3.5 for me. Now those new measurements, which I should have done in another color, my apologies. are the crotch. I'm going to measure from there to the other one to make sure that's bigger than my thigh. I'm going to connect from the knee to the crotch. If you have a wider thigh and waist than that and hip, all you have to do is unfold the fabric and you'll have double the amount of width to work in. Now, from that initial line, we're actually going to draw up towards the waist, because this gives us a general waistline. So we're going to measure the rise in the back, and we're also going to measure what it was in the front. Notice for me there's an 1.5 inch difference between the two. So I'm going to go to the side seam and figure out exactly what it is between those two and mark that. 1/4 the waist minus 1/2 inch is 7. Now obviously from this measurement to this measurement is way more than 7. We usually have a bit of a curve on the hip. I'm going to choose to go in 1.5 inches at the side, and then I'm just going to smooth it back down to that line. Now there is a type of ruler called a hip curve that you can get that is a rounded shape, but it's just a very gentle curve. We are going to end up putting a dart in when we try them on so that it fits perfectly. So I wouldn't worry about this being too big of a measurement at the moment. That is on purpose. So then we're just going to connect this line to this line. And the last thing to do is to connect the crotch at the back and at the front. And you just want it to be a gentle scoop. I usually do a bit more of a scoop on the back because I got a bit of a booty. So the last thing we have to do is add seam allowance. The nice thing about these rulers is if you figure out exactly how much seam allowance you want, so let's say 1/2 inch, I figure out exactly which line that is on my ruler, and I can just line that up with my sewing line. So I'm doing all the straight parts with the ruler, and when it comes to the curve, I'm just making a couple of notches, or a couple of marks, and then connecting those. You can do this also with a measuring tape, it just takes more time, which is fine. I'm going to give extra at the waist. I'm also going to give extra when it comes to the hem, but I am only going to give that again 1/2 inch along this dart. The dart's just like a little triangle of fabric that you take in that gives shaping usually around a curve. And actually this bottom part, if we're doing this correctly, it should be straight down, and then we're going to cut it out.
We're going to make a little notch right on the front crotch seam where it starts to curve. That's where the zipper is going to end. From there, we're going to sew along that crotch line down to the bottom of that hip line, leaving the zipper part open. Once that's done, we're going to flip to the back crotch seam or the bum seam and sew that all the way from the waist to the hips.
To do the dart, the easiest way is to find the bottom of the dart and put a pin in it. Then we flip to the other side and put a pin where that pin is coming out. So we have a pin head on either side. Then, when you open this up, you have a pin on each one. If we fold along this seam line, so the tops match, the pin here shows us how far to go. With the dart, you just sew so that it comes off the fabric, the folded fabric, right where that pin is. We can fold along that line. We've got that pin still there. There we go. Now we have 2 curved darts. So if we lay it flat again, you can see that's where our side seams are. Now what we're going to do is open it up and connect the bottom of the 2 crotch seams. So the bottom of the front crotch matches the bottom of the back crotch. And then you start from that crotch to crotch seam, and we're gonna sew all the way down the leg on one side. And then we go all the way back to the crotch and flip it to the other side. And we're gonna sew all the way down the other leg. So you can put a zipper in for the fitting. I like to leave it open and just pin it, and that way if there's any issues, I'll know. And when we try it on, we're gonna leave all the seams on the outside so we can adjust them as we need. So I put the pants on and I just pin them where the zipper's going to go. I ended up having to stitch rip from mid-calf down, and I just put a mark here to add 1/4 of an inch because I need a little extra space to be able to get in and out. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out the fit of the waist because that affects everything else, and then we're going to adjust as we go. The front is fitting nicely. The back has some extra, so we're going to put in 2 darts. The darts don't have to be perfect, we just have to make sure it fits snugly, and we'll measure between the 2 and find an average after when it's laying flat. I want these pants to be fairly tight at the waist because there's going to be a lot of moving around and I don't want them to fall off my butt. And trying to keep that as straight as possible, I like to put a couple more pins in just to get an idea of where the line goes and where it's going to end. Again, these don't have to be perfect. This is very hard to do on your own. We're going to take it off afterwards and double check. There we go. There's a lot of extra here in the seat, and there's a lot of extra here in the crotch. I'm going to choose one leg to focus on, so we'll make all the adjustments to one and then put it on the other side as well. I'm going to go with this side because this is the side we have our actual seam lines on. So first off, this dart needs to come down a little bit more, so we're going to pin that till that's laying flat. We're going to do a very quick job on the other side as well. Now, there's a weird bagginess here, and I believe that's because the crotch needs to be taken in just a bit. So the curve is going to look a little different. All I've done is I've put my hands at the seam and then put my fingers in more so it forces the fabric together. This is a hard one to pin, and we're going to follow that down. Okay, yeah, that's looking way better here. That's pretty decent. It's also going to be covered, and it looks great from the back. Oh, but you gotta keep your legs open because the pins. In retrospect, if you're pinning your crotch, you should really use safety pins. They stab a lot less. So now it's time to take these off and adjust the pattern. So the first thing I'm going to look at is these back darts before I take them out. Mine look to be about 6 inches deep, so that's 3/4. So this one is the same. That makes it easy. And then down here, 1/8 shy of 1 inch on each side of the dart. Okay, so they are pretty similar. And how far out are they? That one was just over 4. That one was closer to the center. So we're going to bring it into 3 1/4. We can use the hip line as a straight line. 6. And then we had on either side. And then about here was about half. There we go. So now we have a new dart on the back. And if I want to, while I'm right here, I can draw that seam allowance right away to make sure that it's going to all line up. So that's that mark done. My side seams look about the same, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm just using orange as my alterations color, and I'm just giving it a very slight line where the pins are. When we lay it out flat, we'll take a moment to make sure that that actually makes sense. And we're going to do the same here. Mark on one side where the pins are, mark mark on the other. This is why it's nice to have many multiple colors. And with doing a mock-up, we can draw all over it, and that's okay. And then the last thing to do is the very tricky crotch. We only have to mark one side because we're only adjusting on one side. The other side is the not worry about marking. So because everything is basted, we should be able to just rip everything apart. So I'm gonna put this side to the side because we don't need it, and we're gonna focus on this side that had the initial markings on it. So we're gonna tidy this up here. So I'm gonna shift that over to the line and curve it up. Because it only needed to come in a little bit extra, so that should. And then here, just adjusting that crotch because we're taking it in 1/4 of an inch or a finger's width. And taking in the front about the same, approximately. But we're also taking in this crotch line to be more of a curve. We're going to give ourselves a new seam allowance line for all these new seams that we've drawn. We've got to remember to come out on the bottom here. So we want it to come out 1/4 of an inch. So we're gonna have to, you can pin an extra piece of fabric here if that's easier for you. Let's do that. And at this point, we have to go straight down. And I'm just moving these marks to the other side as well. Because we have this center line, we can make sure that it is perpendicular. So I did end up going a little further out. I took this 1/4 out mark and lined it up to the knee and then drew that straight down as if that was new, so it does get a little wider towards the bottom. And then we're going to draw our new seam allowance based off of that line. You can always redraw this whole thing on a new piece and cut it out again. I feel like that's a waste, so I tend to just pin an extra piece and go from there. Now we're going to cut all the extra bits off. So cutting our new seam allowance, we're going to adjust the thigh, that adjusted crotch. A little bit of this dart comes out, and the other thigh. And there we have our fit pant pattern. So at this point, if you're not sure, this would be a good time to recut this, re-sew it, try on another mock-up. I'm gonna move forward on to cutting it out because I am confident that it will fit enough for what I wanna do. So because I'm using scraps, I actually had to sew 2 pieces of material together to get it long enough for the pants. So this is gonna be a tight because this is the amount of fabric that I have. So I like to move it over as far as possible to one side so that I have the most possible material left over just in case I need to do something else with this color. Now normally you'd pin this to cut it. I know it's not going to shift on me. So up on the darts, what you're supposed to do is make a notch where the seam allowance is. You know exactly where you're sewing from. And I'm going to take a moment now and put in the pin underneath so that I know exactly where it goes. And before I forget, I'm also going to put the bottom notch in here for the zipper. And then we have our pants. The one piece that's missing is the waist facing. So we're going to take this extra material that we cut off. We're going to use our chalk on this, and it's going to curve up most likely. So we're going to start down here. We're going to draw the waist, marking where that seam allowance is. And where the dart is, we're going to overlap dart to dart and then lay it flat as if the dart didn't exist. So see how it curves up? That's normal. We're tracing along that top line. Then we're gonna get the other side, which is the front, lay that dart on top of it as if it wasn't there, and oh no, that's okay, we can deal with that. Because you want those stitching lines lined up. So I've just drawn a bit so we know. I'm gonna unfold this so we can lay this piece on top and get the full waistband. So we've got this weird curve, and for the facing, there's going to be the 1/2 inch at the top of seam allowance. I know we drew 1 inch, but I want mine nice and high. Then I would like it 1 inch deep, and then 1/2 inch at the bottom. Basically, we want it 2 inches all the way across. So to do this, just make sure that it's always perpendicular. This is another time you can use your ruler. If you prefer, figure out exactly 2 inches is the width of the ruler for me, so that's nice and easy. And we're gonna cut it a second time, but it has to be facing the other direction. I'm trying to fit it on the fabric because we want this part to be straight so that it matches. And then we have a waistband. So the next step is you want to put interfacing on the waistband. Just on the iron, with iron-on interfacing, you cut a piece slightly bigger, you iron it on, and then you cut away the extra so that it's this size. And I'll meet you at the sewing machine. We're going to use an invisible zipper on the crotch so we don't see the zipper at all. So the first thing we're going to do is sew from the notch down, and making sure we're just at a nice 3 length. Remember to back tack, which is when you go backwards, at the beginning and the end of every stitch. This keeps everything from coming apart on you. And before we go too much further, we're just going to take a moment to do the darts. So we've got the mark. I'm going to stick the pin straight through on both of these so that when I flip to the other side, we have pins sticking straight out. Which means if I stick a pin straight through this way, where it's coming out, we have pins on both sides. So when we open it, the heads stay where they are, so that when we fold this, we can line up the top of the notches and we know exactly where that should end. Which means we can sew this, and right where that pin is where we want to be, just at the edge of the fabric. And then we grab our second one here. So we're being nice and careful so we don't stab ourselves with the pins. I like to do the darts first before things get shifted around, because you can make sure everything lines up the way you want. Okay, and it just gets thinner and thinner as we go on this side. So we have 4 darts total. Invisible zippers can get a little tricky, and I'm gonna have to switch my foot before I go too much further. With the seam allowance folded back, you can see where it's gonna lay, which means that you want to put the front down here. We're actually going to sew along this edge, the far edge of the zipper, just to make sure it's in the right place on both sides, and so that we know that the zipper is going to sit right. This doesn't have to be perfect, it just means that when we go to sew the actual zipper, everything's where it should be, and you aren't fighting to get the placement right. So when you come down to the part that you've already sewn, we're going to sew it onto just the seam allowance. And normally you want to pause, zip the zipper up, and then sew it again, this way you can get past where the zipper was. And this makes sure that when I go to do the other side, I can just line that up at the bottom and start on the seam allowance, the other seam allowance, and go up. Make sure that this is pulled out of the way because you don't want to catch it underneath. And then when I get here, I pause and I unzip the zipper again. You can also take the needle out and do it that way. Okay, if you could stop falling off, that'd be great. Hey, it lines up. Now obviously we don't want to see that much zipper, otherwise what's the point of an invisible zipper? But now we know exactly where it's going to sit. When you sew an invisible zipper, you want to push the teeth to one side, and so right in that crease there, but not on the teeth. A lot of machines will have extra feet, and one of them will look like this, where it's got a ridge, where you can press that ridge against the side, and it folds the zipper open. Now, I personally have a zipper foot, which holds the zipper exactly where you want it to be. I bought it separately from my machine because I do a lot of invisible zippers. Okay, so all we have to worry about is opening up that zipper and stitching that down because we've already got the general placement, and I just go as far as I can. And now you can see that one side is a lot better. I'll do the other side, which will really show you the difference. So there we go. There's the tiniest bit of brown. If we wanted, we could go back and do it more, but it is going to be hidden by the flap. You can see as there's pressure on it, there's just a tiny bit. If we had a slightly lighter color, it would blend in more. And then we're going to switch back to the everyday foot. Okay, and we're gonna fold that crotch in half so that we can sew up the back, the butt seam. We're gonna do a second stitch on the butt, 1/4 of an inch in. So this is a safety stitch so that if the first one breaks, the second one is there to stop it. So now we line up the crotch to the butt. I like to open the crotch seam because that's what it does for the zipper on that side. And I'm just gonna fold all the butt seam to one side, making sure that those middle seams line up as perfectly as possible. You can always pin it. I back tack the crotch a lot because I don't want it to come apart. So I'm just evening up the cuff. In theory, it should be straight. Mine wasn't because the fabric warped a bit as I was sewing it. Most of this is going to be under the boot, so I'm not too worried about it. We're going to flip the pants right side out. And all we're going to do is you fold it once at 1/2 inch and a second time at 1/2 inch. Now, if you haven't done a lot of sewing, you can definitely start with pinning everything, where you fold it first, and as you pin it, pin from the inside and pin across. You always want to pin perpendicular to the way you're sewing, so that as you sew, you can take it out before you get there. You never want to pin the same direction as you're sewing because then the needle's all in the way. And then you sew on that top folded edge all the way around. If you do it the way I'm doing it, you're stitching on the inside, so you just want to make sure that your bobbin thread is the right color. You should always trim all your threads as you go. My machine cuts most of them for me, so I don't have to worry, but for seams like that, I do take a moment and make sure. We're just gonna do the other hem while we're here. Now on something like this that is a completely round seam, you don't have to back tack, like go back and forward at the start and end, because you're going over what you already sewed when you finish. So all that's left on these pants is the waistband. We are going to start with the waistband. And we're gonna sew the back together at that seam allowance mark. You wanna follow the crotch and figure out which way you pushed all that seam allowance. Find that center back seam. And on the good side of the pants, you're gonna put the top of the facing. Remember how it's scooped up? We want that scoop to go along here. We're gonna line up that seam we just sewed at the back with the center back of the pants, and we're gonna open up the facing so it looks like that. And we're just gonna put a pin there to keep everything together. We're gonna start at the center back. Now notice I'm keeping the pin in as I put it under my machine. Then once the machine foot is down and holding everything in place where I want it to, I'm going to take the pin out because you should never sew over a pin. Now, as we sew, you always want to push all of your seam allowance from your darts towards the center back. So we're going to lay the facing down, and we're going to put the waistband down, and we want to line up the top edges. And we're just going to gently with our fingers press the seam allowance of the dart towards the back, making sure that the dart is laying flat first and there's no folds underneath in this part. Then we fold that back and stitch along. And you can take your time, you can pin this ahead of time. It's a little harder because it's on a curve. Now I'm going to unzip the zipper just a bit. I'm going to keep the zipper folded back. And I'm going to use, there's a little piece of plastic at the top. We're going to go just where the teeth edge as my top edge, line it up with the waistband, and use that right as the line to sew against, so that I can use it on the other side as well and know that they line up. This is the tricky part. We're gonna go on the other side. This one's a little tricky because we've got the facing on top. So it's easy to make sure that the dart's facing the right way, or is open, but you also want to make sure all your seam allowance underneath is pushed in the right direction. And making sure we line up with that edge. There we go. The next step is top stitching. We want to make sure that all this bulky seam allowance goes towards the facing. So you push it all up, and we're going to sew just to the side of that seam we sewed before. So this is the seam we sewed before, and this gets all pushed up, and we're going to sew just 1/4 of an inch, not even, closer to 1/8 of an inch on that side. And as you go, you want to take your time, use your hand underneath to pull all that extra seam allowance up. The next step is we're going to go to the iron. We're going to fold this all so that the seam is just over. So this side looks really perfect and there's nothing there. And on this side you can see all of that. So I'll be right back after I iron this. While I was at the iron, I took a moment to also fold all this extra underneath so it's just past the teeth so it won't get caught. I'm going to cut the extra off. And I'm going to pin that, and we're going to pin all the way around because we really want to make sure this stays nice and flat. I also folded that. You can cut a bit of that zipper off just to give it a little less. And there's a couple ways we can finish this off. So we could stitch it by hand so that it's pretty on this side and you can't see anything. We could only attach it at the major points, but we're gonna go the easy way and we're just gonna stitch it all the way across. Because we're not going to see it because the top covers everything. So I take that pin out and I'm just gonna keep it a similar width all the way around. I have marks on my machine and I've just picked one and made sure that the top edge lines up with it as I go around. Try to not stab yourself as you go. And then you can go back and trim all this extra if you'd like. Be very careful that you don't accidentally trim the actual pants. I'm just trimming it where the zipper is. And we have pants. Oh, our line went a little off here. I don't think it's too bad because it's going to be covered. And we have pants. They fit pretty well. I'm happy. I can move. I have to like hike them up to, but that's because there's no stretch in them. So if you have an issue, I have a little bit of a gape here because the fabric did relax a bit as I was moving around. So you can also just take it in a little bit if you have that. You can put a bit of elastic. I'm probably going to put the elastic so I can still move. Yeah, just along the waistband on the inside. And we have Keyleth pants. Ta-da! Pants! Overall, I'm really happy. I did end up putting the elastic at the back, and I ended up adding a little bit of elastic under the bottom of the foot. It's called a stirrup, just to keep the pants tucked into the boots as I put the boots on. I think if I were to make these again, I might get myself a material with a tiny bit of stretch. Stretch makes things way easier to fit, even if it just had a little bit, like this light green. But all in all, I'm quite happy, and I'll probably use this pattern again. Thanks for coming on this journey with me. I'd love to see what yours look like. Tag me on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Those are the main ones. And I'll see you next time.